Hello, welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer, and this is Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the people at the World Puja Network for hosting us every 2 weeks here and giving us this time to share with their listeners an update on SEASTI and the OrionProject.org, and I'm very pleased today to have our scientist for the OrionProject.org, Dr. Ted Loder, who's worked with me since the 1997 on these projects, and he's here to talk about what he'll be presenting at the conference we're having October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in Rio Rico, Arizona, where we're going to spend every night out under the stars making contact and practicing meditation techniques and doing pujas. And during the day, we're going to have presentations by a whole host of people. I'll be making one of the presentations, but Colin Andrews of Crop Circle fame will be there to give us an update on the big breakthroughs that have happened in the last year in that field. And Richard C. Hoagland, who's a New York Times bestselling author and former NASA consultant, who runs the Enterprise mission, will be also presenting at this conference in Rio Rico, Arizona. And, of course, Dr. Loder will be presenting out-of-the-box technologies and the prospect of real new energy and anti-gravity, so-called propulsion breakthroughs that could remake our civilization into a sustainable and peaceful and abundant world. So we'll be there October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and you can find out more about that at cseti.org. That's cseti.org. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Loder, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to have a chance to sort of chat about this before it actually happens.
Yeah, why don't you give us a little bit of a preview of the sort of things you'll be talking about here at the conference in Rio Rico in October?
Okay. Well, I spoke last year at the conference, very excited, and a lot of interest from people there, and sort of an overview of things. And I titled my talk, The Development of Transformational New Energy Technologies, and as you said, outside the box. And we really, what I'm really going to be talking about is transformational. Some people call them disruptive. I guess that's a matter of perspective.
Right, no matter of perspective, yeah.
It's a matter of perspective. But really what we need, we can't, our energy technology, energy structure in both the United States and the world, actually, is at a stage, as you well know, that one needs to make big changes, not incremental changes. We've been going too long with incremental changes, and the only thing we've gained, as far as I can see, is we've increased the amount of oil exported from the Middle East to the United States, and et cetera, making these incremental changes. And we nearly need disruptive or changes that will totally change the paradigm or the outlook on how we use our energy technologies. Now, that doesn't mean that, as you well know, that we can't have technologies that do incrementally change things, because we need both kinds.
Right.
But I think people need to see that there are technologies using technology and science that isn't even talked about within the public sector or in the news mainstream media sector or whatever else. And this is technologies that either go to the quantum vacuum or the zero-point energy, or there's a whole bunch of these things, including anti-gravity or counter-gravity technologies that have been around for a while. So I'm going to sort of introduce that talk, and then look at there's great quotes, and I'm sure you've heard this before, of all truth passes through three stages. And this is Arthur Schopenhauer in the actually early 1800s said this. First truth is ridiculed, and then it's violently opposed, and then it's accepted as self-evident. And what we're trying to do with what I'm going to be talking about is look at technologies that are somewhere between ridiculed by mainstream science and violently opposed, and in some sectors accepted as self-evident. So actually the technologies we're looking at sort of fall into all three of those categories.
Right, and part of what we're doing with the OrionProject.org is to educate policymakers and people in the Obama administration and folks around the world, as well as the general public, that these sort of scientific breakthroughs have been around for the better part of 100 years in one form or another, and that
exactly.
The reasons for the fact that we don't have them out yet is is purely a function of macroeconomic power and geopolitical power rather than any technological impediment. And that, many people, when they hear that, in fact, and when we can prove, as we can, that these sort of technologies have been around for decades that would solve the global warming problem, would give us free energy for our homes and cars, that would have zero cost once you had your generator put in, that would enable the world to lift itself out of poverty. A world today that has, we just had a statistic come out from the United Nations, 40% of the world's population does not have literally a pot to pee in. They do not have plumbing or toilet or anything like that. 40%, it's 2.8 billion people. That, the kind of huge problems facing this planet in terms of poverty, peace, justice, these are all things that are not going to be solved by drilling another oil well in the Gulf of Mexico. It's just simply not, too little too late, and we have way too many people to solve that problem. So these are the technologies and the sciences that, while they have been suppressed violently at times and ridiculed frequently, we know exist, and which would really lift the burden humanity has placed on Gaia, the Earth, a conscious living being that we're just, murdering, basically, and give us a sustainable and peaceful civilization. And, the trick to all this, of course, is having a group of people who know the science, the means to develop the technologies financially, and then, of course, the courageous leadership to bring it out and stand up to these sort of corrupting influences. And, you said initially, Ted, I think it's very interesting that some people would call these kind of breakthroughs disruptive, and that is a term that actually is used in trade. And, in fact, I met with one of George W. Bush's advisors on nuclear power, who was a lawyer, a couple of years ago, and we were at the University Club down the street from the White House in Washington, and he, he looked at me when he, got the briefing on these technologies, and he says, yes, he says, the problem is these technologies are too good, referring to the fact that they would disrupt the multi-$100 trillion infrastructure of centralized utilities, electric power grids, oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, et cetera. I said, yes, but it's really too late to do the tinkering around the edges by squeezing 10 or 20% or 30% more efficiency out of the system. We need a complete transformative breakthrough, and that's exactly what the OrionProject.org is attempting to raise the funds to do, and also to identify the scientists who can do it with us.
Yes, the time for as I noted earlier, the time for transitional stuff as the answer to the problem has sort of long passed, and Lord knows the talk about disruptive. A war in the Middle East with nuclear weapons would be rather disruptive, and
right.
that's one of the potential tracks that we're going on right now, and it's all related to the oil and the energy issues, and certainly the Gulf of Mexico oil spill is actually, it turns out to be, in terms of economics and health of people in that region, majorly disruptive.
Exactly.
So we really have to sort of get the word out, educate the public and the leaders and the politicians of the world that there are other energy sources and there are technologies in existence that can tap this. But it's going to take, as you noted, it's going to take some money to make that happen. This doesn't come out of a vacuum. The energy may come out of a vacuum, but accessing it and developing the technology to access it takes plain old money, time, effort, and some really hardcore, hard-working scientists to make this happen.
Right. Exactly. Why don't you go through, Ted, if you don't mind, for the listeners who aren't familiar with some of these terms like energy from the vacuum and zero point, sort of what the theory is about how these electromagnetic generators work that make them different from a conventional generator or a conventional motor that's burning oil or something.
Well, there's several types of technologies that we're looking at, and many other people are looking at as well. And one is, you mentioned magnetic motors. In fact, there's a company just very recently that I'll talk about that has come up with an electric motor that they, by using the power of the energy that is in magnets and very, very cleverly extracting energy as this thing spins at high speeds, they're able to get more energy out of the system than goes into it. And it's not, they aren't using any magic. They're using the power of the magnets, and that energy was put in the magnets by somebody who built the magnets. So that's one type of thing, but that's very clever engineering. The other energy or energy source of energy deals with the fact that there is a tremendous amount of electromagnetic energy in a vacuum or in nothing, and it's a potential. It's not there, but it's the potential, but it can be extracted, and this electromagnetic energy is flowing around electrical wires and whatever else. But if you set up a system in which you sort of break the way it normally operates, you can actually extract energy from that technology. Is this black magic, hocus pocus? Well, I will be pointing out that there's an interesting company in Europe called Aquapol who makes, and you'll see where I'm going in a second, that makes this dehydrator that they've built tens of thousands of these units to put in houses all over and museums all over Europe.
Right.
And it just sits there, and it actually takes three kinds of energy: gravity wave energy and electromagnetic energy, and probably tachyon or some other kind of energy. They don't know exactly how it works, but there's a set of antennas in there, and this energy is polarized, and it actually pushes the water vapor back into the foundation away from the building. So it essentially dehydrates or dries out a basement. Now, it works. No energy has to be put into the system, and yet it does work.
Right.
So that in itself is actually proof that there is an energy source that they can't see, they can't normally measure it using normal technology, but there is a source of energy that with the right technology can be tapped, extracted, if you will, transformed into an energy that we can use in our three-dimensional world,
right,
in our present technology, and actually use to do useful work. And so this is when people say this is impossible, this doesn't happen, I said, well, here's one of the proofs, and I'll be talking about that a little bit in the talk.
Right,
of
exactly.
Energy.
Right. Yet these are not, like urban myth, theoretical things, and this is what a lot of people need to understand is that for decades there have been various people, all the way back to the time of Nikola Tesla, that have made these sort of breakthroughs, but it's like J.P. Morgan, said that Tesla as well as Westinghouse. We really don't want something we can't put a meter on, because if you're pulling energy out of the, call it what you will, the quantum vacuum of space around the generator, or the expansion coefficient of space-time expanding, which is one of the OrionProject.org's new proposals that we'd like to see funding for, then you really can't put a meter on it. You wouldn't have a transmission line going from a power plant. You wouldn't need that power plant fed with coal and oil or natural gas burning it. Your car would have this kind of generator, so it's an electric car that doesn't need to be plugged in, that would be pulling the energy out of the area of space around the vehicle. And these are things that have been proven. I mean, there have been mainstream physics articles that have proven the existence of this so-called zero-point energy field. And yet the connection hasn't been made by the policymakers, most of them. Or they either don't know, or they don't want to take on the powerful, corrupt interest of the fossil fuel and nuclear power industries.
Or both.
Or both, or in the financial industries. I mean, the petrodollar and the whole derivatives, commodities trading, the futures markets that trade in all these commodities at Goldman Sachs and elsewhere. But the reality is that, these things are kind of hidden in plain sight. And this is one of the amazing things that Dr. Loder and I discovered as we dug into this, is that it's there, but no one's connected the dots, because, and when they've tried to, they've all been sort of, as Ed mentioned, they're either violently opposed or ridiculed or both, because it upsets the apple cart, as it were, of the macroeconomic geopolitical system, which is at this point tantamount to global economic slavery. A lot of people don't realize that there are 200 or 300 corporations and individuals who literally possess over half of the net worth of the world of 7 billion people. And it's the biggest disparity in history in terms of that. And it has consequences. But, those folks many of them who have been involved and may know about these sort of projects exerting all kinds of influence to keep these things secret. And I think part of what has to be presented is it's sort of like when I was first briefing the CIA director about the UFO and ET issue. I mean, the main thing, he didn't need to be convinced that there were UFOs because he and his wife had seen one. What he didn't understand is who would be keeping this secret and why. Because unless people understand the why, it doesn't make sense. The internal logic breaks down. But in this case, the why is obvious to anyone who thinks about it, and that is, many people say, well, gee, wouldn't some company make a lot of money by selling these new generators or motors? I go, yeah, but think about this for a minute. Let's say you drive a Chevy Suburban, and, the engine in that thing's worth about $5,000. But over the course of the life of that car, if it's going to be on the road 15 years or whatever, it's going to use approximately $40,000 to $50,000 or more in oil. So that motor, the return on that motor isn't in the profit of selling the motor. It's in the supply line of oil and gas to it. Same thing with the electricity at your house. Your heat pumps use a certain amount of electricity. They may cost, $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 or $2,000. Depends on how big the heat pump is and how efficient it is. But over the course of 20 years of those heat pumps whirling away, they're going to use tens of thousands of dollars worth of electricity at today's rates, and that's assuming rates don't go up, and they're going to. So the money isn't in the big multiplier effect in the economy, in the macroeconomic order, isn't in selling a device. It's in supplying the energy to that device. When you start talking about transportation, propulsion, same thing with jet engines. I mean, jet engines are very expensive, but they pale. I mean, you look at the service duty cycles on a Boeing 747 engine or what have you, the amount of petroleum that thing sucks over the life of that engine is mind-boggling compared to the cost of the engine itself. Mm-hmm. So you can take every sector of the economy, whether it's your home heat pump, whether it's your car motor, whether it's a jet engine, what have you, and the real action macroeconomically is in the supply of that energy. So what happens when what Dr. Loder's talking about occurs and someone comes out with an operational generator or prototype that proves that the energy can be pulled out of the zero point or quantum vacuum energy of space around us, and the energy doesn't cost anything. And the generator or motor, once it's mass-produced, would not be costly. It wouldn't cost any more than the motor that's in your car. It'd probably be simpler than the motor that's in your car right now, especially if you have a Prius, which has a hybrid motor that requires an electric motor and a gasoline motor and all the lithium-ion batteries. So what you would have is a much simpler power plant, but you would cut off completely the need for the supply chain, which is the big multiplier effect that actually adds up to hundreds of trillions of dollars when you start talking about all of the coal, all of the oil, all of the gas, all of the central utilities, all of the commodities traded, all of the jet fuel, all of the heating oil, all of the natural gas for your home and industry. I mean, it's massive. So, this is really why this stuff has been kept secret. And, of course, we had the unfortunate thing happen within the last 6 months where 3 or 4 top secret scientists that we'd gotten to know very well, who had worked for various 3-letter agencies and Department of Defense and corporate entities, were wanting to work on these projects with the OrionProject.org, and they were all one by one picked off, threatened off, waved off, however you want to put it, because there are so many powerful interests that will step in and disrupt this. And this is one reason why we've asked people to go to the OrionProject.org, and there's a letter there, and you can ask the president and your senator and congressman to look into this issue and support with a little bit of support into this area. It's going to take moral courage to do it because, as we know, money really talks in Washington. And in lieu of that, it means that we, the people, have to go and find the funding to put these scientists together in a safe environment that's technically supported and has the right equipment there to build these systems up. And that's what the OrionProject.org really is trying to do. Now we just have come together with a brand new proposal that has a great deal of science and technical information in it that if there's anyone, if anyone listening knows of someone who can actually support that proposal, they should contact us, because we'd be very eager to meet with them and let them see not only what we have, but the kind of technologies we've uncovered. And one part of that is that, while I can't name the source, there is a former intelligence official that had provided one of the scientists that we work with that has worked in some of these classified projects in his past, with several thousand files of top-secret patents and technical information that has been given to us in the last couple of months. Now, Dr. Loder has gone through this and sort of organized it. It was a huge task, and thank you, Ted, for doing that. Mm-hmm. But what we really need to do is have a team of people who can study it and start building these systems and testing them, because it's a sort of a mother lode of potential engineering and technical information that came to us through a very reliable source. And I know the original source of all this intelligence, because separate from the scientist who gave us this file, who had worked with this particular intelligence source, I had known someone else separate from this engineer who also knew the name and the activities of this particular intelligence agent. So we know that it's legitimate. And so these are the sorts of things that are just, a snapshot of what we could do if we had a modest amount of funding. I mean, we're talking $3 to $5 million, and we could have a laboratory with, a dozen or so people working doing this. And, to give its perspective, the county I live in near University of Virginia only has about 150,000 people. We have, literally spent recently $6 million just building a cat and dog shelter. Now, believe me, I love cats and dogs, and I love pets, but, this project is certainly worth the capital funding you would put into a dog shelter.
Totally agree with you. And one of the just an observation on those files you mentioned is that the types of there's a wide variety of different instruments and technologies and tools and devices described within that technology, and it takes a group of scientists with diverse backgrounds to really be able to assess it. I mean, I've gone through it, and I've talked to some people about some of the technologies in there, but you really need an expert in multiple areas, and ultimately what we want to do is bring together the electrical engineers, the mechanical engineers, the physicists, the people skilled in electrical circuits, and bring a group together so each one can assess it from their own technology background.
Right.
That's the way. We need a team of people. Individuals, almost no individual has the diverse and wide set of skills to be able to analyze and assess technologies in this wide variety of areas. So that's certainly one of the things this proposal we've put together addresses that sort of issue.
And we have identified some wonderful people who are ready to do this, except unfortunately they have families and day jobs, and they can't do it for free. I mean, one of the amazing things about people like Dr. Bravo and Dr. Ted Loder and things that I've done and others is that we've been doing this without compensation. But, it's been a sacrifice, but most people just can't drop everything they're doing and drop their obligations and work for free and move to some other place, because the reality is, and so, what we're asking for is the ability to have the facility, whether we rent it or buy it, and outfit it with proper laboratory equipment and fabricating equipment, and a team of people who really are expert in these areas, which is, a sort of an arcane area, and be able to do these things. We think that within 1 to 2 years, because of the intelligence we've gathered and the kinds of people in our network that have given us information about how these systems work, I think we could completely, have some real breakthroughs, and it's not at all out of reach at this point. But we have to do it, and as Ted mentions, it needs to be a sort of a multidisciplinary team of people
Absolutely.
And you've really got to have some super specialized equipment, because a lot of these systems, without getting too far into the weeds technically, because I know this is not a scientific audience per se, deal with kind of phased and pulsed, very high voltage systems. So, if you have your computer plugged into a 110 socket, your regular household socket, that's 110 volts, and it's pulling more current. But these are systems that use very little current, but there may be tens of thousands or even millions of volts. And this is where you get into what are being termed transdimensional or hyperdimensional physics and electromagnetic effects, where objects can levitate, where you begin to pull energy out of the expansion of space-time. And this is non-trivial in terms of customizing electronic equipment and what have you, so that they can operate under those parameters, because most equipment is used to dealing with the world that we live in of 110 or 220. Some industrial things are a little higher, but generally speaking, people aren't dealing with tens of thousands or millions of volts.
That is so true. And the sort of average a voltmeter that one has at home or whatever else does fine for making sure your sockets are working and your batteries are good and this sort of thing. But when you're dealing with frequencies other than 60 hertz, which is what 60 cycles per second, which is what we have in our house and in the United States, and 50 hertz or 50 cycles per second in Europe, that's pretty. Those frequencies are pretty low. Some of these systems use thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of cycles per second hertz, very, very high frequency things, and as you noted, very high voltages. And so you really need very specialized equipment and the people who know how to use them.
Exactly.
And so it gets out of the normal electrician, electronics, college graduate. It gets into some pretty esoteric areas, which is why, of course, we need specialized equipment and specialized people to do such a thing. I wanted to add just a touch back upon the history you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yes.
Tesla talking about this, and he described some of these things as radiant energy. But Tesla worked in these, as most people, listeners know, I think, from the late 1800s, 1890s, basically up until 1940s. Was his main period of work with technologies. In fact, most of his major discoveries and technologies were in the late 1890s to the 1910 period.
Right.
Without being too exaggerating things. But in 1934, there was a physicist by the name of Paul Dirac, and he described this energy that we're talking about here, and he described how to extract it.
Right.
And to quote him, he said, simply introduce sharp little energy perturbations with sharp gradients, and the pulses pop out electrons from the Dirac sea. So this is in 1934. So people say today, well, why haven't we heard of this? And I'd say, well, physicists have talked about this and known about this stuff, and Paul Dirac was one of their one of their heroes, along with Feynman and a few others that are sort of well known. But that's 1934. He talked about this. We're talking almost 80 years ago.
Right, and T. Townsend Brown, T. Townsend Brown was working in the late 20s up through the 50s on specialized high voltage systems that would create a sort of what we call electromagnetogravitic effect, sort of anti-gravity effect around an object. And we know people in top-secret Department of Defense labs and corporations that we're working with who have seen this phenomenon and have given us information on how to further pursue it and exploit it. Because there is, we're people that Ted and I have spent a lot of time with, have witnessed things that they reach a certain frequency and voltage, and bam, the thing just goes right into the ceiling, and it obviously is being propulsed with a heck of a lot more energy than they were putting into it. It definitely has what's called over unity, meaning that there was more energy being pulled out of the environment propelling that object than you have to put into it from a man-made source. And this is where you get into this whole concept of quote-unquote free energy, where once you master that and begin to do it on a regular basis, you're able to then apply it in various ways, whether it's for energy use at home or businesses or a car, propulsion, or what have you. So these are all things that are eminently doable and for which there's an enormous amount of information on. What has been lacking over the years is that a lot of the people who've come across these things and actually come out with something that works have either been threatened off, like some of the scientists that we were working with this spring did, or they have been bought out. And, they basically, someone's offered $10 million or $50 million for the invention, and it's basically put on a black shelf. And
now, that's one of the many ways to, quote, suppress or get rid of this technology, either buy them out or and very often that happens. Somebody will be offered in the millions usually, and usually people are willing to sell things if they've been working hard at it and haven't gotten anywhere financially for $5 or $10 million, some less. But very often it's a front company and said, with promises to develop their technology and bring it out to the world. And very often it's a front company who buries it on a shelf. And that's definitely one of the many ways that these technologies have been kept off the market, out of people's sight.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And
anyway,
I hope that people understand also that this is something that, in terms of the folks that Dr. Loder and I have had an opportunity to meet with, some of them are some of the most senior scientists in the Department of Defense system. These are not people that are just sort of like, and we've been to their labs and we've been to their facilities. This is not an urban myth we're talking about. And yet, the frustration for everyone who's in the system is that the beast, as it were, have their claws in them so far that they can only move so far. They know, and I've had some of these folks in these programs tell me they really need a group like ours, that's a NGO, a non-governmental organization, to put these things together and come out with them independently, because the people who are in the system are in this matrix, they use the term, movie's term, where they're kind of stuck in this matrix. And so, but what we have been able to do is gather an enormous amount of intelligence and information and data and what have you. And, Dr. Loder's been key in this. We've had a lot of help from other people like Dr. Thomas Bearden and others. And we have a huge network, the best in the world. And so what we really want to do now is to take this from the informational level and experimental level that we know has been done and start to come out with some practical things that would solve the environmental and energy problem and would show the world that there is an answer beyond what's being talked about now. Our tax dollars are spending $90 billion in the stimulus and the Department of Energy plan to put it into things that are just tinkering around the edges. There is not one red cent of that $90 billion of our money going into these sort of breakthrough technologies, which is absolutely insanely crazy.
And we thought that would be the case. We thought we had sort of hope, I just might add, we had hope that the RPE program, which is kind of like a civilian DARPA program, would really address major breakthrough outside the box technologies. But when you look at the technologies that the RPE program has funded, they're, as you described it, tinkering around the edges. There's some things that are innovative, certainly, but it's not going for the gold ring here that we're talking about.
Yeah, and so much of it's going into things, like solar and what have you, and which is great. But like my home, the estimate to make it completely self-sufficient on a solar system in Virginia in this climate and it's around $100,000 US. Most people aren't going to spend $100,000 US for their electricity. You see, if they have it, it's sort of a joke, and it's not that I'm down on solar and wind. I think that's better than burning oil, but we can do much better than that in a way that makes this kind of breakthrough affordable and practical for everyone, not just for the people who are Hollywood types or Nantucket types who like to drive a hybrid and put these things on because they got millions of dollars to burn. When you look at 7 billion people and the 1.3 billion people in China rapidly industrializing, where they're putting on a new coal-fired power plant every week that has no scrubbers on it. It's putting all that soot right into the air and into the water. Those kind of solutions, we can all feel kind of self-congratulatory about it and feel good about it, but in reality, it's a pseudo-solution, because what we've got to do, if we're going to deal with the whole planet and the crisis it's in, is to come up with these kinds of real breakthroughs that would solve these problems. And the thing is, we know it can be done, and so that's where we really want to move. We want to move into a world now very quickly where these things become known to the masses and is something that can be applied and can be put into practical application as common as a cell phone, instead of something that's very esoteric, known by a handful of people in classified projects or what have you.
And we know those people exist. We know the technology exists. Just a note on that RPE program. One of the technologies, this goes back to what I said earlier, one of the technologies deals with dehumidifiers, becoming more efficient membrane-based dehumidifiers.
Right.
And yet I just spoke at the beginning of our discussions today about this company in Europe that has sold 30-plus thousand devices used for dehumidifying, which use no energy at all. And the technology has been around for 20 years. So there's almost a disconnect between both what is available and what could be available and what people are actually beating on or supporting in research. And that little program, I'm not picking on it particularly, received $680,000 to do that work.
Yeah, exactly. And why don't you talk a little bit about the water-to-fuel concept that Stan Meyer worked on, just to review that again, because it's really variations on a theme where it was a specialized high-voltage pulse system that did some magic to break the bonds between hydrogen and oxygen, H2O, that makes water to create a fuel that would burn clean.
Well, that technology was developed by Stan Meyer, among others, actually. He wasn't the only person, but he's the one who sort of got at the nub of it and figured out how to do it. And basically, by using various frequencies and sharp pulses, I mentioned sharp pulses earlier about extracting quantum energy from the quantum vacuum, he was able to extract or break apart many more water molecules than one would predict using normal run-of-the-mill chemistry and physics. Right. In other words, the process was actually, as several people who in our group, scientists, have said, was actually extracting energy from the quantum vacuum in some manner and then applying that to break apart the water. So this is one place that he got his very, very high efficiency, way over unity in terms of the energy that was then available from the water molecule that had been broken apart when it was recombined or, quote, burned, combusted together. They got much more energy back out of it than the energy you had to put in it. Well, that technology, Stan Meyer's technology, the Orion Project, orionproject.org, had been looking at that extensively for a while, but another group got the bid, if you will, and is working on that technology. We don't know how they're doing.
We don't. But the thing is that we know the basics of the physics around it, and
that is correct.
We could, with the proper supporting, and we actually know some other people who've worked in for some corporations that have done this and kept it secret for other purposes. So this is something that through some iterative back and forth trial and error using various analyzers of frequencies that we would be able to have a breakthrough on this, I think, in a very reasonable amount of time. And I think that's why people have to understand that, it's all part, if you look at it, one is like taking water and making a fuel that when you burn it in your vehicle or a generator puts out water vapor, which is what the Stan Meyer things were doing. But it's the basic, or there's the anti-gravity propulsion where things lift, or there's the generators that are just electric or electronic generators. But the concepts are the same. The concepts are about using the electromagnetic pulsed high voltage in very specific ways, and from that kind of central nexus of concept, you get these various applications. And in the case of Stan Meyer, I just want to put in a parenthetical note, that was an accidental discovery. He was working for a radar plant, I believe in Ohio, where they made radars, and he noticed that when there was a certain frequency and pulse of the radar system, water that was around went from water straight to hydrogen and oxygen at very low power input. So it was an accidental observation, if you want to, like so many scientific discoveries are, accidental if you don't believe in some mysterious hand guiding things, which I do. And so he saw that, and it was an amazing thing. And then he began to, along with his twin brother, Steve Meyer, experiment with things and put together circuits that did this and did it quite effectively. So I find that very promising. Because if he was able to make that observation and then translate it through some experimentation into a system that ran a car on water, regular water, and that's not a hoax, it actually happened, that's a really promising thing. And it means that with some support and getting these people together who understand these things, we could do it as well.
I might add on the Stan Meyer that one of the technology, he actually worked on many technologies, not just the water to fuel, if you want to call it that, or water-powered car, water-powered technology. But one of the technologies that he worked on was, it was described as the EPG, electrical particle generator, which is basically magnetized gas in a circular system that was spun around like in a donut. The gas was just moved because it was magnetic. It would go by coils of wire surrounding it, and if you know any science at all, you realize that a magnetic field, a coil of wire, copper wire, which is placed in an alternating magnetic field, will produce electricity. And so he developed this system. Interestingly enough, that was one of his technologies that was sequestered by the U.S. government.
Exactly.
For quite a period of time, and he wasn't allowed to, it had a security order put on it. He wasn't allowed to talk about that particular one. So
when we first started looking into this, we didn't know that, and we met someone who actually was working with Stan Meyer at the time that he got this NSO, as it's called, a National Security Order, that put a gag on it. And so, there's some, these are people who are real people and scientists and who worked on these things. And, it is a crime against the earth and humanity, in my opinion, that this isn't out. But that's the world we live in. I mean, money talks, and there's a lot of people with powerful vested interests who simply do not want this kind of information out because it kind of upsets the apple cart of what they have. But what's very important is to understand that we can do this, and this is what's going to be exciting in Rio Rico, because some of what I'll be presenting and Dr. Loder will be presenting, and also what Richard C. Hoagland will be presenting, will be talking about a whole new paradigm in reality that goes from consciousness into these types of hyperdimensional and transdimensional physics and the implications for it. So it's going to be really exciting, and Colin Andrews actually talks about this quite a bit with what is being shown to us through the crop circles, and a lot of it is technical and technological and paradigm-oriented, where it's a whole new paradigm in understanding reality.
It's going to be very exciting, actually. There's going to be a lot of synergy between the different, the four speakers there and what they're talking about. It's even though the topics may sound different and diverse, in reality, they're all going to be there's going to be a nexus of information and core of information there that's going to be really fun to get a handle on.
Yep.
I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Yeah, no, it's really going to be wonderful. And again, if people want to find out more about it or come, it's at cseti.org, cseti.org, and it's October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in Rio Rico, and we're going to be out under the stars every night up on this roof terrace at this resort that's south of Tucson, Arizona, that's in this beautiful area. And then during the day, we'll be having all these presentations in the afternoon. And it's a nice schedule because the morning everyone is basically off. Of course, we're usually out till 12, 1 o'clock out under the stars doing a group meditation and the SEASTI contact protocols. And if you go to cseti.org, you'll see a photograph of a really amazing ET spacecraft that appeared over the group last year that Raven Nabulsi took a picture of. And there's all kinds of trans-dimensional and other events happening at these gatherings. So that's sort of what we do at night, and I'll be conducting those exercises and training people in the meditation techniques and in the remote viewing approach and the contact techniques we use. And then during the day, we'll be hearing from all these wonderful folks like Dr. Loder and Richard C. Hoagland and Colin Andrews.
Yep, it should be very interesting. I think, and another nice thing about a lot of the attendees, the people there listening and talking, a lot of very bright people who are actually involved in some of these technologies and these what have you. And so there's going to be feedback and actually discussion during the question and answer sessions, et cetera. And there's enough time within the schedule of the program to actually have time to sort of interact and talk with other people there. And it's great for essentially networking other people interested in these diverse topics.
Yes, and it's really nice, too, because there's a beautiful pool and outside garden area and place to hang out. It's a resort, really, out in the desert. And it's really conducive to having time with folks to be out during the morning before things get started after lunch when we do these presentations. And then the nighttime, we're all out together up on this roof terrace. And I think that one of the things about it that's wonderful is when you have, dozens of people going into deep consciousness and higher states of consciousness and meditating together, it has an effect, I think, on the whole planet. I think it helps. One of the powerful things, the reason we wanted to do an event like this, is instead of having 20 or 30 or 40 people together, to have a much larger number of people together doing this kind of a group meditation and visualization for world peace and universal peace and transformation and all this. I think it's a very powerful 3 days and nights because it pulls people together to do that, and it has an effect beyond what we can measure and see, I think. And I've always felt that the world goes forward first in vision and higher consciousness and thought, and that's what we do together in the evening.
Mm-hmm. Well, what else can we say here? I think we've covered a lot here in this.
Yeah, well, I wonder if you talk a little bit, I know it's a little more futuristic than energy generation. I just think it's interesting for people, since we talked about the UFO matter, to hear a little bit about the out-of-box concepts as it pertains to, if you will, mass cancellation and so-called dematerialization and anti-gravity that we've come across.
Well, I don't have any. I'm not going to go into any sort of scientific issues on the subject, other than to say that this stuff is real, and we have many witnesses. Anybody who's listening to this, who's familiar with the disclosure projects, realizes that we had and we have multiple witnesses who have been involved with the breakthrough developments in the anti-gravity, counter-gravity world and building technology for many decades.
Right.
So that's definitely a real type of thing. And frankly, again, talking to various witnesses, the amount of energy, once you know what you're doing, have the right voltages and frequencies, the amount of energy actually to run a system and is not great. It's not as much as one might think it was. If you do things right, you create a system in which lift can occur. Remember that T. Townsend Brown, who we mentioned earlier, had actually discovered that effect in the late 1920s, and by 1950s had worked with people within the defense departments and shown them how to do this. The various airplane companies at the time in flight, where everybody was involved in it, and it suddenly disappeared. People stopped talking about it in the mid-50s, about 54 or so.
Correct.
Plus or minus a year. And suddenly nobody mentioned anymore that they were working on it. And the reason is that there were major breakthroughs during that time in determining how to do it in the extant real world. And that was based upon both T. Townsend Brown and others, Tesla and other people, working in that field, coupled with, as people know, reverse engineering of some of the downed craft, UFO craft or extraterrestrial craft that became available for a variety of reasons.
And Dr. Loder and I have actually, along with Dr. Bravo, have actually met with a very, very senior scientist with the in the Department of Defense who had not only had seen these things, but has also been able to document exactly what Dr. Loder just shared about the fact that it was around 1954 that all of this went deep black. Basically, we just fell off the radar screen. And before that, in the late 40s, early 50s, there were mainstream aerospace journals talking about these high voltage and sort of anti-gravity lift kind of systems. So it's actually, this is, again, not an urban myth. And imagine, if you will, initially we just, our focus is that we've got to get something out that gets us off of the cannibalizing and global destruction associated with fossil fuels and nuclear power because it's so toxic. But looking down the road, and not that far, imagine all the surface roads that there are out in the world, those going back to farmland and wilderness areas, because your travel is above ground because you're floating with these anti-gravity systems. And we have people who actually saw, I've met personally a man who saw the what are called ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles, in a hangar in California back some years ago, and they were the early models, but their power-ups, these things were just floating above the floor, and they were one was about 25 feet in diameter, one was about 50, and then there was one that was 100 feet in diameter. But their startup power system were 24-volt marine deep cycle batteries. And once it started up from just battery system, it then started pulling energy out of the space around it, and did so in such a way that these coils caused the lift, and they were just hovering there. And so we know that this is possible, and these, he believed, were older models that were probably from the late 50s, early 60s. So, it's amazing to think how long we've had this capability, and yet we're still building, highways and tearing up the earth and, using fossil fuels and jet fuel and all this stuff. So
yeah, I hope I'm looking forward to Richard Hoagland's talk, because I suspect he'll at least mention, if not talk about it at length, the scientific program that's been going on within, shall we say, the black parts of NASA.
Right.
And there's a sort of a separate space program going on in the United States that deals with these technologies and has been for decades. And I'm hoping he'll speak about that. It should be interesting.
Yeah, well, I believe he will. And don't forget that, you can go to disclosureproject.org and actually see some of the witness testimony that we have from these sort of people who have firsthand seen these events and these kind of objects. And more importantly, you may want to look at the clip of Senator Inouye of Hawaii during the Iran-Contra hearing, when he said, look, there exists a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not reading from the quote. But it's a very interesting thing for a senior U.S. senator to have said, and this was decades ago. So, that's what we're talking about. But, really, we the people have a right to this knowledge, and the earth and all of humanity has a right and a desperate need for these sort of for this hidden knowledge to come forward. And the reason I wrote my third book is called Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, where I go through all of my own experiences doing this for now 20 years, and actually dates back before then when I had ET contact when I was a teenager. But I think that people have to understand that these are a sort of amazing revelations that we're now 50, 60 years into an era where we don't even need surface roads between cities, and that and one thing I remind people is that the highest thing that people think we have are rockets, but rockets were from the early 40s from Wernher von Braun, and jet engines were from the 30s. And the gasoline engines and diesel engines in your car or truck were from the late 1800s.
That's correct.
Coal-fired power plants and steam things were from the mid to late 1800s. So from the mid-1800s through the 40s, early 40s, is all that we're using now. All the big breakthroughs from the early 40s to now have been suppressed, and that's why the world is so screwed up. And so, really, and it's that simple, really. I mean, there are a lot of complex issues here.
The simplicity of it, yes.
Yeah, but that's it, and a lot of people just don't think, gee, we have fiber optics and computers and doing all this whiz-bang stuff, and, supercomputers and lasers and all this stuff, but they're being run off a coal-fired power plant somewhere. You see, so and your cool Apple, iPad or phone is running off of stuff or charging off of stuff into a grid that's basically from the 1800s. So this is what people have to get their minds around: is that there is a fundamental problem here that has got to be addressed out of compassion for the Earth as a living being and also humanity as a group. And most people just want to live in peace and have a better world. And even the people who are industrializing rapidly in India and Brazil and China. But, what happens when 7 billion people live like Americans and Europeans do with air conditioning and cars and fossil fuels?
It just can't happen under our present paradigm.
It can't, but it's not fair that these other people have to live in abject poverty without even plumbing. So where 40% of the world right now doesn't have it. So this is a fundamental justice and peace issue as well as an environmental issue, I remind people, as well as a technological and national security issue. So it crosses a lot of various domains, really.
Well, there we are.
And that's what we'll be focusing on, that and more, at this conference in Arizona, October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Well, I hope to see some of you folks there, and you can go to CSETI.org and register. And if not, I hope to see you at another event. We'll be in Joshua Tree National Park in November for a whole week at a smaller event, but there's still space for that if people want to come. It'll be November 7th through the 13th. And you can find out about that also at CSETI.org. So I'd like to thank Dr. Loder for his time this afternoon to share his expertise in this area. And the people at the World Puja Network, thank you very much for hosting us every 2 weeks here. And so until next time, be well and keep working for a new world. This is Dr. Stephen Greer. Bye-bye.
And Ted Loder. Bye-bye.